Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back through time, back into the candlelit halls and drafty stone corridors of European palaces. Places where destiny was supposed to be written in velvet and gold, but usually ended up scribbled in gout, paranoia, and a suspicious number of cousins marrying cousins. So dim the lights, settle into your blankets, and let's wander together through some of the most unfortunate royal family trees ever planted. Families where being born with a crown waiting for you didn't guarantee glory. More often, it guaranteed migraines, fragile jaws, or a court physician hovering in the corner holding a leech jar. We'll be moving slowly, gently, from one dynasty to another. No big cliffhangers, no frantic turns. Just a long, drowsy stroll through bloodlines that probably should have stopped a few marriages earlier. Let's begin, naturally, with the Habsburgs. Because where else could we start? The Habsburg dynasty is basically the poster child for royal inbreeding. If you've ever seen a portrait of them, you've probably noticed the famous Habsburg jaw. It was less a jawline, and more a geological feature jutting out like a shelf, sometimes so pronounced that chewing food became optional. Court gossip suggested some of them couldn't even fully close their mouths, which, to be fair, did save them time on dental care, but didn't make conversation any easier. The dynasty rose to prominence in medieval Austria, and eventually stretched across Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond. They were ambitious, they were wealthy, and they had a very particular approach to dynasty building. Their motto could have been, "Why fight a war when you can just marry your cousin?" The Habsburgs weren't subtle about it. They arranged generation after generation of cousin marriages, uncle-niece marriages, and in at least one notorious case, double uncle-niece marriages, all in the name of keeping power in the family. The result was that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled houseplant someone had forgotten to water. The most extreme product of this strategy was Charles II of Spain, sometimes nicknamed the Bewitched. Charles was born in 1661, after over 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding had ripened. He was physically weak, chronically ill, and so developmentally delayed that he didn't walk until age 8. His jaw was so enlarged and misshapen that eating was a daily ordeal. Talking wasn't much easier, and yet he was king, which meant that his every difficulty, his seizures, his infertility, his inability to rule independently, was played out on the grand stage of Spanish politics. Spain, once the richest and most powerful kingdom in Europe, was being ruled by a man who could barely digest his dinner. The empire fell into decline, partly because of poor leadership, but also because the entire dynasty had run out of healthy heirs. Charles died childless at age 38, leaving the throne vacant and sparking the War of Spanish Succession. So, the Habsburgs demonstrated a valuable lesson. You can hoard crowns, lands, and titles all you want, but if you never invite some fresh DNA to the party, your dynasty might end with a whimper. Let's drift gently away from Spain now, and settle for a moment in France, specifically with the tragic story of the Capetian dynasty, and one of its most unlucky branches, the House of Valois, by the 14th century. France had produced a long line of kings with solid medieval names like Philip, Charles, and Louis. But toward the end, things began to unravel. King Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad, ascended the throne in 1380. At first, he was called Charles the Beloved, which sounds promising. But soon, people had to adjust the nickname because Charles suffered from sudden and terrifying bouts of psychosis. In his 20s, Charles began experiencing delusions. He would forget who he was, or run wildly through the palace halls, convinced his enemies were hunting him. On one occasion, he attacked his own companions with a sword. Another time, he insisted he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Courtiers were ordered to approach him with extreme caution, because naturally, no one wanted to be the guy who accidentally broke the king. His madness left France politically unstable. Rival factions exploited his condition, and the 100 Years' War dragged on longer, bloodier and messier than it might have. But beyond the political consequences, the story of Charles VI shows how fragile royal families could be. His illness was probably hereditary, showing up in different branches of the dynasty. And because of course he was married off to Isabella of Bavaria, his children carried the risk forward. His daughter, Catherine, for instance, married Henry V of England. She passed on some of the same traits to her descendants, which meant that the Lancastrian and Tudor lines in England weren't exactly free from instability either. So, what started as one king's unfortunate mental health struggles quietly seeped through dynastic marriages, echoing across Europe for generations. Now, let's make our way to Russia, where dynastic misfortune had a more dramatic flair. The Romanov dynasty is remembered for its glamorous final act, the doomed family of Nicholas II. But long before the Bolsheviks, the Romanovs were already struggling with hereditary troubles. The most infamous case was hemophilia, a blood-clotting disorder that plagued the family in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Tsarevich Alexei, the only son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, was born with the disease. A simple bruise could lead to life-threatening internal bleeding. The boy's condition became a tightly guarded state secret because the stability of the monarchy rested on his survival. His mother grew desperate for a cure. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the wandering mystic who somehow convinced her he had healing powers. Whether Rasputin truly helped Alexei is still debated. Some say his advice to stop certain medications actually prolonged the boy's life. Others suggest he simply got lucky. Either way, Rasputin's influence grew because of Alexei's illness, and his presence at court eroded the dynasty's reputation. By the time of the revolution, people weren't just angry at food shortages and political repression. They were also deeply suspicious that the royal family was under the spell of a bizarre, bearded holy man. So here again, a fragile hereditary condition didn't just affect one child. It destabilized an entire empire. We can also drift over to England, where cursed dynasties tended to unravel in spectacularly dramatic fashion. Take the Plantagenets, for instance. They produced some of the most memorable kings of medieval England. Richard the Lionheart, King John, the villain of Robin Hood stories, and Henry VI, who was less memorable for his victories, and more memorable for his breakdowns. Henry VI ascended the throne as a child, during the height of the 100 Years' War. Unfortunately for him, he inherited not the courage of Richard, but the fragility of Charles VI of France's maternal grandfather, which meant long bouts of catatonia, paranoia, and withdrawal. At times, he was completely unresponsive, unable to speak or recognize his surroundings. This left England vulnerable. Rival claimants circled, and eventually the Wars of the Roses broke out, a dynastic freefall that saw the throne passed around like a very bloody game of musical chairs. Henry was eventually captured, imprisoned, and quietly killed in the Tower of London. His dynasty collapsed, making way for the Tudors, another family that, as it turned out, wasn't exactly free of cursed fates either. We'll pause here for a moment, take a slow breath, and let the absurdity of it all drift past. Because what these dynasties really show us is how often power was less about strategy and more about biology. A few generations of poor health, a badly chosen marriage, a cousin a little too close on the family tree, and suddenly an empire crumbles. So, as you rest tonight, let's carry that soft, oddly comforting thought. Entire kingdoms rose and fell, not because of grand battles, but because someone couldn't chew properly, and with that, we'll drift forward to another cursed branch of royalty. Welcome back, everyone. If you're still awake, and if you're already drifting off, that's probably the healthiest response to hearing about centuries of royal misfortune. We're going to glide now into England's most theatrical dynasties, the Tudors and the families that managed to fill history books, television dramas, and countless student essays, all while being plagued with fragile health, questionable marriages, and the occasional beheading. Let's begin with the Tudors, since they're usually the crowd-pleasers. The Tudor story kicks off with Henry VII, who came to power after the Wars of the Roses. He wasn't supposed to be king. His claim was about as sturdy as a soggy parchment. But he won at Bosworth, mostly because Richard III had the charisma of a wet cabbage and the luck to die in battle. Henry VII secured his dynasty by marrying Elizabeth of York, uniting the rival houses. Romantic in theory. In practice, it meant his children carried the genetic baggage of both sides of a very war-torn family tree. Still, Henry was careful, calculating, and miserly. He left behind a full treasury, which his son immediately squandered. That son was, of course, Henry VIII. Henry VIII is remembered for being large, loud, and having 6 wives. But less often mentioned is the constant anxiety about heirs. He was obsessed with securing a male line, and rightly so, because the Tudor family tree was alarmingly short on branches. Every time a child died, young witch was often dynastic panic set in. Henry's own health was far from ideal. In his youth, he was athletic and handsome, but by middle age, he had leg ulcers, possibly diabetes, and a body that required being winched onto a horse. He grew paranoid, suspicious of plots, and increasingly violent toward his wives and advisors. It was less the portrait of a glorious monarch, and more the tragic decline of a man whose doctors kept recommending things like bleeding and leeches as treatments. His desperate search for a son led to endless marital drama. But in the end, only 3 children survived: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Not exactly a sturdy dynasty. Edward VI, Henry's only son, became king at the age of 9, which is not the ideal age for managing a kingdom. He was intelligent, pious, and enthusiastic about Protestant reforms. But he was also chronically ill. Historians now think he may have had tuberculosis. He was constantly fatigued, often bedridden, and prone to wasting away. By the time he was 15, his health collapsed completely. He lingered in pain for months, coughing, unable to gain weight, and slowly realizing that the Tudor line would die with him. He tried to secure a Protestant heir by naming Lady Jane Grey as his successor. She lasted 9 days before Mary swept in. Edward was gone at 15, and with him the fragile male line of the Tudors. Now, Mary I, better known as Bloody Mary. Her reign was short and troubled. She was determined to return England to Catholicism, and equally determined to produce an heir. But Mary suffered from what's now called phantom pregnancies. She genuinely believed she was with child. Her belly swelled. Her symptoms matched, but no baby ever came. These false pregnancies devastated her emotionally and politically. They also meant her marriage to Philip of Spain never produced the heir she wanted. By the time she died, childless and unpopular, the Tudor dynasty was dangling by a thread that left Elizabeth I, the Virgin, queen, though historians debate just how literal that was. Elizabeth was shrewd, witty, and politically skilled, but she also inherited the family tendency toward frailty. She survived smallpox, which left her scarred, and later suffered from dental decay so severe that foreign ambassadors described her as speaking through black stumps. Elizabeth ruled for decades, bringing relative stability, but she refused to marry or name an heir, which, from a historian's perspective, is very on brand for the Tudors. Lots of drama, no long-term planning. When she died, childless, in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended. Now we drift gently into the Scottish cousins who inherited Elizabeth's throne. The Stuarts were already carrying their own genetic baggage. Their family tree was filled with intermarriages between European royals, and their track record for keeping monarchs alive was less than impressive. The first Stuart King of England was James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the great-grandson of Henry VII, which meant that his claim to the throne was legitimate. If slightly diluted, James was an odd figure. Bright, scholarly, but physically awkward. He had a pronounced tongue-tie, which made his speech difficult to understand. He was also plagued by chronic digestive problems and a habit of drooling. Courtiers politely ignored this because he was king, but it didn't exactly make him a commanding presence. He also had a deep fear of witchcraft. He wrote an entire book on the subject, called Demonology, in which he earnestly explained how witches were plotting to bring down kingdoms. He believed storms at sea were caused by witchcraft aimed specifically at him, which, given his health issues, might have been the least of his worries. James's son was Charles I Short. Fragile and plagued by a stammer, Charles was not ideally suited for politics. He believed in the divine right of kings, which is a convenient philosophy if you're a king, and less convenient if you're a parliament. His inflexibility led to the English Civil War, his capture, and ultimately his beheading in 1649. The Stuarts, naturally, didn't take this setback well. Charles's son, also named Charles, was restored to the throne in 1660 as Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch. Charles II made up for his father's stiff dignity by filling his court with mistresses, illegitimate children, and a general air of hedonism. But the dynasty's fragility continued. Charles had no legitimate heirs. His brother, James II, took over, but he was both Catholic and spectacularly bad at reading the political room. His reign ended with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when he was replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange. This might have solved the immediate religious crisis, but it didn't solve the succession problem. Mary died childless. Her sister Anne became queen. Anne's story is one of the saddest in English history. She was pregnant at least 17 times. Only one child, William, survived infancy, and he died at age 11. Anne's body was racked with gout, arthritis, and obesity. By her later years, she could barely walk, and her health deteriorated rapidly. When she died in 1714, childless, the Stuart dynasty came to an end. So once again, a royal family that seemed poised for greatness collapsed under the combined weight of fragile health, poor choices, and sheer bad luck. Take another slow breath. Here, it's worth noticing how these dynasties weren't undone by battles or revolutions alone. Often, they crumbled quietly in sick rooms and nurseries, with infants who never saw their first birthday, or monarchs too ill to lead. The Tudors and Stuarts produced more drama than most soap operas, but beneath it all, the same pattern repeats. Fragile bloodlines, and dynasties that couldn't keep themselves alive. And as we drift further, we'll leave England for now, and float over to the glittering courts of Central Europe, where yet another dynasty was busily sabotaging itself from within. Welcome back again. If you're still with me, tucked under the blankets and half listening, don't worry, you're not expected to remember any of this tomorrow. These monarchs hardly remembered what they were doing themselves. We've drifted from Spain's jawlines to England's endless succession crises. Now let's float quietly across the Channel, into the glittering but creaking palaces of France, where the Bourbon dynasty reigned. They gave Europe some of its most famous kings. They also gave it some of its most fragile. We might as well begin with Henry IV, founder of the Bourbon line. Known as Good King Henry, he had a knack for surviving assassination attempts. People tried to stab him, shoot him, and poison him. For years, he dodged them all, until, naturally, one day in 1610, someone finally succeeded. He was stabbed to death in his carriage. His son, Louis XIII, inherited the throne as a child. Louis was shy awkward, and unwell for much of his life. He also had a famously tense relationship with his wife, Anne of Austria. For 20 years, their marriage produced no children, which made everyone at court nervous. Eventually, and somewhat miraculously, 2 sons appeared, Louis and Philippe. Rumors circulated about whether Louis XIII was actually the father. Given that his nickname was the Just, but his personality was more the melancholy, gossip wasn't. Surprising, those sons grew up, and one of them became Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. Louis XIV is remembered as the absolute monarch par excellence. He built Versailles, staged elaborate rituals, and made sure the sun metaphor was repeated so often that courtiers probably got sick of hearing it. But beneath the golden glow, things were less perfect. Louis fathered a staggering number of children, both legitimate and illegitimate. Many of them died young, thanks to the usual cocktail of poor sanitation, smallpox, and measles. Even the Dauphin's heir didn't outlive him. In fact, Louis XIV outlived almost all of his children and grandchildren, which is impressive, but also awkward when you're trying to pass on a crown by the end of his reign. After 72 years on the throne, the old Sun King was limping around Versailles with gout, toothless and weary. He had buried nearly his entire family. The line of succession skipped several generations, leaving the crown to his great-grandson, a 5-year-old. That 5-year-old was Louis XV. He grew into what people called Louis the Beloved, though by the end of his reign, the Tolerated would have been more accurate. Louis XV suffered from smallpox as a child, barely surviving. He grew up timid, indecisive, and easily swayed by advisors and mistresses. He had bursts of energy followed by long stretches of lethargy, and his health never quite stabilized. He did manage to produce heirs, though he also produced a steady stream of illegitimate children. His court was filled with mistresses, from the famous Madame de Pompadour to the lesser-remembered women who barely lasted a season. Gossip about his personal life spread faster than his decrees, and the monarchy's image began to erode. When Louis XV finally died in 1774, it was of smallpox, the same disease that had nearly taken him in childhood. He was so unpopular by then that his body had to be buried quickly, without ceremony, because no one wanted a riot at his funeral, and so the crown passed to Louis XVI. Louis XVI wasn't cruel or flamboyant or particularly dangerous. His problem was that he was indecisive, awkward, and slightly dull, which is fine if you're managing a quiet estate in the countryside. Less fine if you're ruling France on the eve of a revolution. Louis had been a shy child, more interested in hunting and lock-making than in politics. He was married off to Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess who was just 14 when she arrived in France. Their marriage got off to a famously slow start. For years, they failed to produce children, partly because Louis may have suffered from a medical condition that made intercourse difficult. The court whispered endlessly. Pamphleteers mocked them. And in an age where producing heirs was basically a king's first job, the delay looked humiliating. Eventually, children came, but by then the monarchy's reputation had been battered by gossip, extravagance, and Louis's inability to project authority. When the French Revolution broke out, the king and queen became symbols of everything wrong with the old order. Louis XVI, poor man, wasn't built for crisis. He wavered, hesitated, and generally did nothing quickly, which, in revolutionary Paris, was the worst possible strategy. In 1793, he was executed by guillotine. His wife followed 9 months later. The Bourbon line didn't exactly vanish. They had cousins. Bourbon cousins were like weeds, they sprouted everywhere. But the dynasty never regained the same grandeur. When Louis XVI's brothers tried to take over after Napoleon fell, the magic was gone. Louis XVIII, corpulent and plagued by gout, shuffled through his reign. Charles X, his brother, was even less popular and was promptly overthrown in 1830. After that, the Bourbons lingered in exile, claiming crowns they would never sit on. What's striking, when you look back at the Bourbons, is how much of their downfall was quietly biological. Smallpox cutting down heirs, gout hobbling kings, awkward marriages that failed to produce children on time, and monarchs who lived either too long, like Louis XIV, or not long enough, like so many of his descendants. The French monarchy didn't collapse in one dramatic swoop, it rotted slowly from within, until by 1789 there wasn't much left to defend. Take another slow breath here. Let the glitter of Versailles fade gently in your mind. The chandeliers, the mirrors, the endless corridors. They were meant to project eternal stability, but behind them were fragile bodies, short lifespans, and dynasties that couldn't keep their footing, in a way that makes the Bourbons oddly relatable. They had all the wealth in the world, all the palaces and titles, but they still got sick, still lost children, still struggled with awkward family politics, and eventually still lost everything. As we drift forward, let's leave France behind. Our next stop will be Central Europe again. This time, not the Habsburgs, but the Russian Romanovs, those glittering, tragic figures who managed to combine fragile health, superstition, and revolution in spectacular fashion. Welcome back again. If you're still awake, you deserve a medal or at least a minor duchy. Most people would have drifted off somewhere around the second Louis. But since you're still here, let's move further east. Tonight we'll glide into the icy splendor of Russia to explore the Romanovs, a dynasty that ruled for 3 centuries, from 1613 until 1917. Their story ends in a cellar in Yekaterinburg, with the execution of Nicholas II and his family. But long before that final tragedy, the Romanovs were already living under a cloud of fragile health, poor choices, and the occasional eccentric mystic who wandered into the palace at just the wrong moment. The dynasty began with Mikhail Romanov, a rather accidental Tsar. He was just 16 when he was chosen in 1613. After Russia had spent years in chaos known as the Time of Troubles, Mikhail wasn't particularly charismatic, but he had the one quality people desperately wanted in a Tsar. He wasn't anyone else. Sometimes that's enough. Over the next 2 centuries, the Romanovs expanded Russia into a vast empire. Siberia, the Baltic, the Black Sea came under their control. On the surface, it looked like the dynasty was thriving. But inside the palaces, behind the elaborate orthodox ceremonies, cracks were showing. Let's pause with Peter the Great. He was 6'8", towering over his courtiers. He modernized Russia, imported European fashions, built St. Petersburg, and forced nobles to shave their beards. But beneath the reforms, Peter was plagued by epilepsy, violent temper fits, and a body worn out by years of heavy drinking. By the time he died in 1725, his organs were so damaged that his doctors reportedly struggled to figure out which failure had killed him first. His descendants inherited both the throne and his unhealthy lifestyle choices. Heavy drinking, poor diets, and mysterious illnesses became the quiet background music of the dynasty. But the most famous Romanov curse arrived in the 19th century. Hemophilia. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A bruise, a cut, even a bump could become life-threatening. The gene spread through Europe's royal families thanks to Queen Victoria of Britain, who was a carrier. Her daughters married into various dynasties, and the Romanovs drew the unlucky ticket. When Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra had a son, Alexei, in 1904, it should have been a moment of triumph. The Romanovs finally had a male heir. But soon it became clear the boy was gravely ill. A stumble, a knock, even vigorous play could cause internal bleeding. His parents watched in terror as he suffered, sometimes screaming in agony from hematomas they couldn't treat. The illness was a state secret. If word spread that the heir was frail, it could destabilize the dynasty. So the court whispered, doctors fretted, and Alexandra grew desperate. This desperation is what brought Grigory Rasputin into the picture. Rasputin was a wandering Siberian mystic with a ragged beard, questionable hygiene, and piercing eyes. He somehow convinced Alexandra that he could ease Alexei's suffering. And, to be fair, sometimes he seemed to help. Modern historians suggest that when Rasputin told doctors to stop giving Alexei certain medications like aspirin, he may have inadvertently saved the boy's life, since aspirin worsens bleeding. Whatever the explanation, Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was essential. His influence at court grew. Ministers complained, nobles gossiped, and the public became convinced the Tsarina was under the spell of a disreputable holy man. By the time World War I broke out, Russia was already staggering. Food shortages, military defeats, and political unrest were mounting. And in the middle of it all, the royal family was seen as weak, indecisive, and corrupted by Rasputin's presence. It's easy to forget how isolated Nicholas II really was. He wasn't a cruel tyrant in the style of earlier Tsars. He was, instead, painfully ordinary. He loved his family, adored his children, and had hobbies like photography. But he was indecisive, stubborn in the wrong ways, and utterly unsuited for a collapsing empire. Alexandra, meanwhile, was consumed by her son's illness. She withdrew from public life, focused on Alexei, and let Rasputin's influence grow unchecked. Their daughters, the four famous Grand Duchesses, were raised in a strangely sheltered environment, constantly moving between palaces, often nursing their brother. and kept away from the broader Russian world outside. When revolution came in 1917, the dynasty was brittle. Nicholas abdicated. The family was placed under house arrest. And finally, in 1918, they were executed. But while their end was brutal, the story of the Romanovs as a cursed bloodline had been unfolding for decades. Hemophilia didn't just weaken the heir, it weakened the monarchy's image. It tied the dynasty to Rasputin, and it made a once mighty empire look vulnerable at the exact moment it needed to project strength. And so, the Romanovs became another example of how biology quietly shapes history. A single gene, passed down through marriages made for politics, helped topple a dynasty that ruled 1/6 of the world. Now, let's drift back for a moment. To the broader picture, royal families across Europe faced the same problems. They married within their own circles, over and over. Cousins, uncles, nieces. They shared the same limited gene pool, passing around the same disorders: hemophilia, epilepsy, madness, jaw deformities, gout. The Romanovs were just one late, dramatic example. Their story felt modern because it ended with photographs, diaries, and eyewitness accounts. But the pattern was as old as monarchy itself. Families that tried to keep power pure often ended up weakening themselves. Take another slow breath here. Imagine the grand halls of the Winter Palace, glittering with chandeliers, filled with uniforms and jewels. And then, in the corner, a pale boy coughing into a handkerchief, his parents whispering desperately, while outside, the empire trembled. That was the reality behind the spectacle. Fragile bodies in gilded rooms, dynasties stretched thin, and history waiting, patiently, for the whole fragile structure to collapse. From here, we'll leave Russia behind. Our next stop will take us back to Spain and Austria for another look at the Habsburgs, those tireless champions of marrying their cousins into oblivion. This time, we'll wander through their later years, when the family jaw was at its most dramatic and their empire was quietly falling apart. Welcome back again. We've lingered in Russia with the doomed Romanovs, but now let's drift back westward, to Austria, to Spain, to a dynasty that really deserves a second visit, because they are simply too cursed to cover in one sitting. Yes, we're returning to the Habsburgs. If you remember part 1, we already wandered through their tangled family tree, with Charles II of Spain as its tragic mascot. But the later Habsburgs, those who held on to Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, had their own slow, melancholy decline. Less dramatic than the guillotine or firing squad, more like a candle burning down, sputtering into wax. Let's start with Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor in the 17th century. Leopold was a perfectly competent ruler. On paper, he reigned for nearly 50 years. But his portraits tell another story. A long, drooping face. A jaw so pronounced it looked like a balcony. He could barely chew. And yes, this was the result of generations of cousin marriage. Court artists tried to flatter him, smoothing the angles. But there was only so much oil paint could do. His personal life wasn't much brighter. He was shy, awkward, and had a voice so weak it was said people strained to hear him, which made him an odd fit for the throne of an empire that stretched across Central Europe. His descendants didn't fare much better. The Habsburgs were still trying to keep everything in the family, which meant the jawline grew stronger, while the bodies grew weaker. Charles VI, Leopold's son, reigned in the early 18th century. He had one major problem: no surviving sons, which meant his entire reign was spent desperately trying to convince Europe that his daughter, Maria Theresa, should inherit instead. He even issued the famous pragmatic sanction, basically a legal essay begging everyone to agree she could rule, of course. When he died, Europe immediately ignored it. Wars broke out over the succession. Armies marched, treaties were broken, and Maria Theresa had to fight tooth and nails, sometimes literally pregnant on horseback, to keep her crown. The irony is that Charles spent years worrying about sons he never had. But Maria Theresa turned out to be far more capable than most of the men who had come before. Unfortunately, her children carried on the family habit of fragility. The most famous of those children was Marie Antoinette, whom we met earlier in part 3. She married Louis XVI of France, and the rest, as they say, ended under the guillotine. But back in Austria, the Habsburgs still had their own tragedies unfolding. Take Joseph II, Maria Theresa's son. He was energetic, reform-minded, and determined to drag the empire into the Enlightenment. He abolished serfdom, pushed for religious tolerance, and meddled in just about everything. But he also drove himself into exhaustion, wore down his body, and died at just 48 childless, and convinced he had failed. His reforms were rolled back almost immediately. His brother Leopold II took over briefly, but he too died suddenly after just 2 years on the throne, which meant yet another son, Francis II, became emperor. He reigned for decades, but mostly by doing as little as possible, watching Napoleon rise and fall, then retreating into paperwork and routine. By the 19th century, the Habsburg dynasty had perfected the art of inertia. Their motto seemed to be, survive quietly, even if you're miserable. Which brings us to Ferdinand I of Austria, who ruled from 1835 to 1848. Ferdinand was epileptic, hydrocephalic, and developmentally delayed. His seizures were so frequent that court doctors practically lived in his bedchamber. Despite this, he was crowned emperor, and technically he did rule. But in practice, government was handled by his advisors and his uncle. Ferdinand was known for childlike outbursts. One famous story has him demanding dumplings during a council meeting, shouting, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," which, honestly, might be the most relatable thing a Habsburg ever did. In 1848, when revolutions swept Europe, Ferdinand was quietly persuaded to abdicate. He spent the rest of his long life in relative peace, eating dumplings without interruption. His nephew, Franz Joseph I, then took the throne, and Franz Joseph reigned forever, from 1848 until 1916. That's 68 years of being Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and general figurehead of an empire that increasingly didn't want him, Franz Joseph worked tirelessly. He rose at dawn, signed endless documents, and rarely smiled. His reign was marked by tragedy after tragedy. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sissy, was famously beautiful but deeply unhappy. She grew obsessed with dieting, exercise, and escape, spending more time traveling Europe than at court. In 1898, she was assassinated by an anarchist in Geneva, stabbed with a file while walking along the lakeside. Franz Joseph's only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, was even more tragic. Brilliant, restless, and depressive, Rudolph struggled under the weight of expectation. In 1889, he and his mistress were found dead in a hunting lodge at May, an apparent suicide pact. The scandal shook the empire, and Franz Joseph never truly recovered. And then, of course, there was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Franz Joseph's nephew and heir. His assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 triggered World War I. By then, the Habsburg Empire was already tottering. The war simply finished it off. When Franz Joseph finally died in 1916, he was an old man worn down by decades of funerals. His successor, Karl I, reigned only 2 years before the empire collapsed completely. The Habsburg dynasty, once rulers of half of Europe, was reduced to exile, their empire carved apart. Looking back, the late Habsburgs carried the same burdens as their ancestors: fragile health, weak heirs, endless tragedy. But by the 19th and 20th centuries, the world had changed. Empires weren't held together by sheer tradition anymore. They needed energy, reform, and modernization. And the Habsburgs, with their drooping jaws and melancholic habits, simply couldn't keep up. Their family tree, once overgrown with too many branches, ended up snapping altogether. Take another breath here. Imagine the gilded halls of Vienna, filled with the waltz music of Strauss, the smell of coffee and pastries drifting through the streets. And then, in the palace, a tired emperor with a face to long for its own good, quietly signing papers while his empire dissolved around him. The Habsburgs remind us of how dynasties don't always end with a bang. Sometimes they just wear themselves out. Too much intermarriage, too much melancholy, and eventually, too little left to hold on to. From here, we'll drift forward into one of the more eccentric royal families of Europe, the Hanoverians of Britain and Hanover, where madness, obesity, and petty quarrels made life in palaces strangely comedic and sometimes tragic. Hey again. If you're still with me, you've now survived multiple Habsburg jawlines, the Romanov hemophilia crisis, and the general air of disappointment that hung over the Bourbons. For tonight's section, let's slide gently into Britain, where the Hanoverian dynasty took the throne in the early 18th century. Now, the Hanoverians weren't quite as inbred as the Habsburgs, though they certainly dabbled. Their curse was different. Instead of fragile genes, they seemed doomed to eccentricity, obesity, and spectacular family dysfunction. And, above all, madness. The story begins in 1714, when the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, died childless. Parliament, worried about a Catholic sneaking onto the throne, scoured the family tree and settled on a distant Protestant cousin, George, Elector of Hanover. Thus arrived George the First of Britain. He barely spoke English, preferred German mistresses, and kept his court in London while his heart remained in Hanover. He even dragged his cooks and musicians over from Germany, because of course he did. George I had a famously sour relationship with his son, the future George II. At one point they argued so bitterly that father and son refused to speak to each other for years. Instead, they communicated through servants who had the thankless task of carrying messages back and forth, like medieval text messages that always arrived late. George II wasn't much more charming. He did at least learn English, but he was known for his short temper, his obsession with military parades, and his habit of shouting until his wig slipped sideways. His marriage to Queen Caroline, however, was surprisingly stable. She was clever, witty, and politically shrewd while he mostly sulked and pretended he was in charge. Their reign was relatively steady, though George II became the last British monarch to lead troops personally in battle. At Dettingen in 1743, he was nearly 60 at the time. Imagine a cranky grandfather insisting on marching into battle, shouting in broken German-accented English. Somehow, it worked. He died in 1760, supposedly while on the toileter, suitably unglamorous. And then came George III, and here the Hanoverian dynasty earned its reputation. George III actually started well. He was dutiful, earnest, and genuinely fond of his wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg. Together they had 15 children, because apparently bedtime was never optional in that marriage. But his reign is remembered for two things: losing the American colonies and his descent into madness. The illness of George III has been endlessly debated. Some suggest a genetic disorder called porphyria. Others argue it was simply bipolar disorder, worsened by stress and overwork. Whatever the cause, his episodes became infamous. He would talk for hours without stopping, sometimes foaming at the mouth. He wrote rambling letters filled with capital letters and underlining. He had fits of rage, then moments of weeping. One famous incident has him shaking hands with a tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia, which is both sad and faintly absurd. As most Hanoverian anecdotes tend to be, his illness grew worse after the death of his youngest and favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, in 1810. By then, George was permanently unfit to rule. His son, the future George IV, was appointed regent. Thus began the Regency era, beloved by novelists and costume dramas, but less glamorous in reality, because George IV was not ideal. He was flamboyant, extravagant, and extremely fat. Contemporaries called him the first gentleman of Europe, but also compared him to a bloated whale in trousers. He built the lavish royal pavilion in Brighton, stuffed with oriental decorations, chandeliers shaped like palm trees, and dragons carved into furniture. Essentially, an 1810s fever dream of what exotic looked like. His personal life was a disaster. He secretly married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, which was legally invalid. Then he was forced to marry his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. They despised each other instantly. On their wedding night, George reportedly got so drunk he collapsed on the floor. They produced one daughter, Charlotte, but lived separately for the rest of their marriage, trading insults through pamphlets and lawsuits. George's drinking, gambling, and obesity eventually left him in terrible health. His corsets had to be specially reinforced with metal to contain his stomach. He died in 1830, leaving behind enormous debts and very little dignity. After him came William IV, the Sailor King. He had spent years in the Navy before unexpectedly inheriting the throne. By then, he was in his 60s, eccentric, and refreshingly He swore openly, ate with his fingers, and wandered about Windsor Castle in a dressing gown. His reign was brief, but oddly effective. He supported reforms, including the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. He died in 1837, leaving no legitimate heirs, though he had fathered at least 10 illegitimate children with his longtime mistress. Naturally, this led to the next monarch, Queen Victoria, granddaughter of George III. Victoria reigned for more than 60 years, shaping an entire era. But despite the grandeur of the Victorian age, her family continued the Hanoverian trend of poor health, eccentric habits, and questionable genetic outcomes. Victoria herself carried the gene for hemophilia, which she passed down to several of her children. We've already seen how that haunted the Romanovs. It also struck the Spanish and German royal families. Once again, cousin marriage plus unlucky genes equaled dynastic fragility. Victoria's personal life, meanwhile, was marked by grief. After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, she plunged into decades of mourning, dressing in black and avoiding public life. The image of the dual withdrawn queen became iconic, but also reflected the strange loneliness that seemed to cling to her family by the time the Hanoverian line gave way to the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha branch, later renamed Windsor during World War I. Dynasty had established its peculiar legacy, not as grotesquely inbred as the Habsburgs, not as bloodily doomed as the Romans, but plagued by madness, melancholy, obesity, and spectacular family quarrels. Let's take another slow breath here. Picture the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. A king muttering at trees, another sweating in reinforced corsets, a queen dressed eternally in black, clutching Albert's memory like a ghost. The Hanoverians remind us that royal bloodlines weren't just fragile, they were often absurd, and in their absurdity, strangely human. From here, we'll drift further north into Scandinavia, a region that doesn't always get as much attention, but whose dynasties had their own mix of eccentricities, imported kings, and sudden collapses. Our next stop, the curious case of the Swedish and Danish crowns, where unlucky kings and tragic heirs kept the Nordic thrones wobbling. Hey again, and welcome to our final stretch together. If you've been listening since the start, you've made it through about 6 hours of delicate inbreeding, fainting heirs, and more jaw deformities than anyone truly needs before bedtime. So let's finish this slow, quiet journey with Scandinavia, a corner of Europe where royal dynasties were just as fragile, but sometimes in slightly stranger ways. Unlike the Habsburgs or Bourbons, the Scandinavian monarchies often found themselves running out of kings. Heirs kept dying young, getting assassinated, or simply failing to produce sons. This led to an odd pattern, importing monarchs from other dynasties. Imagine a royal family going shopping abroad, looking for a distant cousin to wear the crown. That was Scandinavia, century after century. Let's begin in Sweden. In the 16th century, Sweden was ruled by the Vasa dynasty, but by the 18th century, things had grown messy. The country had fought too many wars, lost too many battles, and burned through too many monarchs. By 1810, the situation became so desperate that the Swedes elected a completely new king. Not a distant cousin, not even a nobleman from a nearby court. They chose Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a French general who had served under Napoleon. Bernadotte had started life as the son of a lawyer in southern France. Somehow, through a combination of military skill, charm, and sheer luck, he ended up invited to be Crown Prince of Sweden. He accepted, moved north, learned Swedish, and founded the Bernadotte dynasty, which still rules Sweden today. It was in many ways the ultimate fix for Europe's dynastic curse. If your bloodline has collapsed into inbreeding, why not import a fresh one from France? Denmark, meanwhile, faced its own series of oddities. Take Christian VII, who ruled in the late 18th century. He was crowned king at just 16, but quickly spiraled into mental illness. Most historians think schizophrenia. He became erratic, paranoid, and obsessed with self-destructive behavior. He spent hours staring at his hands, mutilated animals for amusement, and had violent outbursts at court. Into this vacuum stepped his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee became both the king's doctor and the effective ruler of Denmark. He also became the lover of Queen Caroline Matilda, who was George III of Britain's sister. For a few years, Denmark was essentially run by a doctor, his patient king, and the queen he was secretly sleeping with. Naturally, this ended badly. Struensee was arrested and executed, the queen was exiled, and Christian VII drifted further into madness until his death. Denmark limped along, yet again wondering why its royal family couldn't quite hold things together. And then there's Norway. Norway spent centuries tethered to either Denmark or Sweden. Its monarchy little more than a side note. But in 1905, when Norway finally gained independence, it needed a king. So, in keeping with the Scandinavian tradition of importing royals, they went shopping abroad and picked Prince Carl of Denmark. He accepted the job, took the name Håkon VII, and became Norway's modern monarch. His descendants are still on the throne today, looking across Scandinavia. What we see is a different kind of royal fragility. Not grotesque inbreeding, not grotesque jaws, but a chronic inability to sustain dynasties without outside help, where the Habsburgs clung to cousin marriages until their bloodlines collapsed. The Scandinavians simply admitted defeat and called in reinforcements, which, to be fair, worked rather well. Their monarchies survived today, largely because they learned not to keep marrying their nieces. And so, as we drift toward the end of this long night, let's gather all the threads we've unraveled royal dynasties across Europe were obsessed with continuity. They wanted power to pass smoothly from father to son, generation after generation. But their methods, intermarriage, rigid rules about legitimacy, desperate attempts to keep bloodlines pure, were often exactly what doomed them. The Habsburgs collapsed under the weight of their own inbreeding. By the time Charles II of Spain took the throne, he could barely speak, let alone govern, and his family tree looked more like a circle. The Bourbons of France destroyed themselves with extravagance and stubbornness. Louis XIV bankrupted the state with his wars and palaces, while Louis XVI stumbled into revolution, guillotine included. The Romanovs of Russia fell victim to hemophilia. Rasputin, an czar so indecisive he couldn't hold together an empire. A single gene, inherited from Queen Victoria, helped destabilize a dynasty that ruled 1/6 of the globe. The later Habsburgs of Austria watched their empire melt away, generation by generation, as fragile heirs and melancholic emperors signed papers and hoped for the best. By the time Franz Joseph died, they were out of time. The Hanoverians of Britain gave us a king who talked to trees, another who drank himself into corsets, and a queen who wore black for 40 years. Madness and melancholy were their family inheritance, just as much as palaces and crowns. And finally, the Scandinavians, who avoided total collapse by importing fresh monarchs when their own bloodlines failed. Sometimes, the wisest choice is to admit your dynasty has run out of steam and borrow someone else's take. One last deep breath here. If you've stayed awake through this entire history of doomed and dysfunctional bloodlines, you've traveled across centuries of palaces, thrones, and anxious genealogies. Behind every crown there was a fragile body. Behind every heir there was a family desperate to preserve power, often at the expense of health, sanity, or common sense. And in the end, perhaps that's the quiet lesson. Dynasties fall not only because of revolutions, or wars, or assassins in Sarajevo. They also fall because of fragile bloodlines, poor decisions, and the simple fact that no family can stay lucky forever. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember them gently. The kings with jaws too long, the queens who mourned in black, the princes who bled too easily, the emperors who wanted dumplings. They were all human in their flawed, weary way, and history, in the end, was less about their grandeur and more about their fragility. And with that, we'll close our journey. Thank you for wandering with me through the most cursed royal bloodlines in European history. Sleep well, and may your own family tree remain blissfully free of cousin marriages. Good night.